It is amazing how terrible political decisions are sold by vested interests. When Biden withdrew US troops from Afghanistan in an unbelievably abrupt manner, Americans were told that troops were being pulled out to save their lives. Similarly, the West is now going to pay a lot of money to Pakistan, presumably for helping Afghan refugees. But at the end of the day, there is a much bigger geopolitical game at play. So what is the West's real interest that has triggered some abrupt moves in Afghanistan? Keep watching to understand the Western conspiracy behind Afghanistan invasion and the abrupt withdrawal. Hi and welcome. This is TFI Global, the foreign affairs and geopolitical analysis arm of the TFI Media Group. I'm your host Atul Mishra, and in this video, I will tell you how the West wants to restrict India and Russia by doing whatever it can in Afghanistan. Let's begin. What the West is doing in Afghanistan continues to surprise us. Now, Dominic Raab, the UK Foreign Secretary, has announced that UK will give £30 million or $41.55 million to Pakistan in aid to help the Afghan refugees fleeing a war-torn Afghanistan after the Taliban's resurgence. So Britain supposedly wants Afghan refugees to stay in Pakistan instead of allowing them to come to Britain. At least this is the narrative that London is selling. Pakistan is the same nation that used to train the Taliban to kill American and British troops who were fighting the Taliban in Afghanistan over the last 2 decades. So we ought to ask this question: are Western leaders really this dumb to continue gifting millions to the very nation that backstabbed them? Well, it is actually not so tricky. The way Afghanistan was invaded by the West and the shoddy retreat clearly show an intention to destabilize India and Russia. And so Pakistan's brazen terrorism is being given a pass time and again. The West funds Pakistan despite its involvement in terror activities by exiting Afghanistan in a shoddy manner and enabling the Taliban to take over the war-torn country. US President Joe Biden has already given a lot of leverage to Pakistan, and Pakistan is unabashedly willing to use the Taliban for controlling Afghanistan. Now, the UK is preparing to give Pakistan enormous leverage with the Taliban. Just like Turkey gets a lot of Western money for hosting Syrian refugees while also using ISIS fighters as proxies in its regional wars, Pakistan will be given generous aid to host Afghan refugees while it also uses Taliban fighters for its regional goals. Pakistan is also known for recruiting more terrorists from amongst these Afghan refugees. But the West is amnesiac and is acting as if it doesn't understand that Pakistan played the role of a facilitator in the Taliban's resurgence. However, in reality, it is funding Pakistan knowing fully well that the money will not be used for the Afghans but for the Pakistan-based terror factories. This is what Pakistan has been doing with the US and other NATO members till now. In fact, when the US waged the war on terror in Afghanistan after the 9/11 terror attacks, Islamabad kept embezzling American aid money to help the Taliban kill American and other Western troops on Afghan soil. At the end of the day, UK may not be happy with the objectionable manner in which Biden withdrew from Afghanistan, but strategically it doesn't mind the Taliban's victory and is simply refusing to undermine or even censor the extremist group. There is an active pro-Pakistan lobby and a strong pro-Pakistan narrative in the United Kingdom. This lobby is presently backing Pakistan with all its vigor and is also responsible for legitimizing the Taliban. Again, it is Pakistan which bats eagerly for the Taliban. So the intimate relationship shared by the Taliban, Pakistan and the West becomes very clear. In fact, even the British Army chief said, we have to be patient, we have to hold our nerve, and we have to give them the space to form a government, and we have to give them, that is the Taliban, the space to show their credentials. He added, we may well discover if we give them the space that this Taliban is of course more reasonable, but what we absolutely have to remember is that they are not a homogeneous organization. The Taliban is a group of disparate tribal figures that come from all over rural Afghanistan. Meanwhile, there are some unconfirmed reports about UK military veterans committing suicide, followed by the chaotic withdrawal of American troops from Afghanistan. So the UK Army chief thinks that the new Taliban is more reasonable, but British military veterans seem to respectfully disagree. Meanwhile, the West can't help empowering Pakistan and the Taliban. Taliban spokesman Suhail Shaheen said the UN delegation promised continuation of humanitarian assistance to the Afghan people, saying he would call for further assistance to Afghanistan during the coming meeting of donor countries. Meanwhile, the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, agreed to provide $2.77 billion unconditional funding to Pakistan last month. While the entire Western political regime is putting money in Islamabad's pocket, Pakistan keeps helping the Taliban and even Al-Qaeda, which has resurfaced despite Biden's reassurances that it was defeated. Recently, Pakistan used armed drones to bomb the Northern Resistance Front, which was showing stiff resistance against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda till now. Pakistan's agenda is clear: help terror groups today, use them as leverage tomorrow. However, the West is refusing to acknowledge Pakistan's role in emboldening the Taliban. The entire Western political regime is silent about the Taliban and isn't acting against Pakistan either. What is the West's interest in brazenly supporting Pakistan? At the end of the day, Pakistan is a creation of the British Empire. It was carved out of an undivided India in such a manner that the British made certain geostrategic gains. Firstly, the British made sure that the division of undivided India created some chaos and weakened India. It was visible during the 1947 partition of India, during which large-scale rioting, mass murders and rapes became common sight. Cyril Ratcliffe, the man asked to finalize the partition, had no real clue about the subcontinent, but he drew lines on the map that for the British would have tremendous geopolitical significance. So the maps were drawn up arbitrarily, and all that British tried to achieve was the creation of an Islamic republic between a communist USSR and a Hindu majority India. At the end of the day, India was the prize. As long as the British stayed in India, Russians were just waiting for an opportunity to invade British India. While leaving India, the British still wanted to keep Russia at bay. So West Pakistan was a buffer state, but it was supposed to do the bidding of the Britishers in South Asia. This is why the British Empire continues to support Islamabad. In fact, East Pakistan, or what is Bangladesh today, was drawn on the other side of India, effectively surrounding India with a hostile regime. It is another thing that India aided the independence of Bangladesh from the Pakistani rulers and broke Pakistan up in 1971, significantly reducing the constant two-front war threat it faced. Yet, West Pakistan continued to serve its purpose for the West. Slowly, the British Empire did recede in the last century, and the US took over as the main global power. However, all through the Cold War, Washington inherited many British policies and values which continue till date. The US-UK alliance is too strong and stands tall even today. Whenever the US goes to war, the UK comes along. Since the West built Pakistan for its own purposes, it has continued the policy of protecting Pakistan and never going tough on the terrorist country. It serves their agenda to go soft on Islamabad. This is the reason why the West did nothing about Pakistan's attempts to build a nuclear weapon. On the other hand, it kept trying to contain India and its nuclear program. In Afghanistan, the West ensured that the Soviets don't rise, so it created the Taliban with Islamabad's help. In the meantime, Pakistan, their non-NATO ally, was allowed to turn nuclear. Mujahideens were created by Pakistan at the instance of the American establishment. These radical Mujahideens were then spread all over Pakistan and Afghanistan, especially in the Pashtun belt. Now, the West and Pakistan may not agree, but Islamabad did have a role to play in Afghanistan's heart-wrenching decline. The West, on the other hand, wanted Pakistan to do its dirty work. The British were in on whatever the US and Pakistan were doing in Afghanistan. In the 1990s, Pakistan kept going rogue, but the West wouldn't sanction the terrorist country. Even when Pakistan backstabbed the West, the latter did not hit back. When the West did sanction Pakistan, it lifted them very quickly. Today, Iran faces maximum pressure and calls for a nuclear deal, but Pakistan invariably got a long rope. The West wants to use Pakistan to create a major headache for Russia by keeping entire Central Asia at the risk of infiltration and radicalization by Taliban fighters. On the other hand, the West doesn't mind if Pakistan mounts a terror threat against India. For the Western deep states, India was not always very acceptable because it developed a good relationship with Moscow, partly because it sensed hostility from the pro-Pakistan West. The West thought that by empowering Pakistan, it can create a security situation against Russia and India. At the end of the day, the vested interests in Western governments have a tendency to destabilize Russia as well as India, driven by 20th century policies that are now bound to backfire and need revision. India is a regional power that fights the Chinese threat at a more realistic physical level than the US or UK. Meanwhile, it has an independent and robust foreign policy that has developed brilliant strategic ties with the United States and the UK. It is an undeniable fact today that containing India is not in the interest of the West. India also strengthened the US-backed civilian government of Afghanistan by pouring in billions. But the West is literally allowing a terrorist nation, Pakistan, to control its western neighbor, Afghanistan, which is already allowing groups like Al-Qaeda to get revived. If Al-Qaeda becomes powerful, more Western lives will be at risk and both the US and UK will suffer. But at the end of the day, whatever is happening in South Asia is just a huge geopolitical game for the Western deep states. They don't care about anything else, including the lives that have been destroyed or might be destroyed in the near future. Even as the people slowly realize the folly of their policymakers, the Western governments want the Taliban to stay and Pakistan to become stronger. They believe this would restrict Russia and India. In the process, they end up making decisions that put innumerable lives at risk.